Welcome to Roles for Supervisors in Confidential Financial Disclosure. My name is Patrick Shepard.
And I'm Cheryl Kane-Piasecki.
In this session, we hope to share with you some tips for reviewing confidential financial disclosure reports as an intermediate reviewer. One brief administrative announcement: on the course page where you're viewing this presentation, 2 sections down, you can find these slides in PDF form. You can print those out and take notes or refer to them later. Also, this presentation will be available as a recording immediately upon the conclusion of the broadcast. So we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. So Cheryl, why do we do financial disclosure?
Well, contrary to what I'm sure many of your employees actually believe, confidential financial disclosure isn't a paperwork exercise. There's actually a very real substantive reason why we ask people to disclose the information that we ask them to disclose, and why we conduct a review of the information that they provide to us. And really, I think it's important, if you are an intermediate reviewer, that you do understand what the certification statement is that is signed by reviewers of the OG Form 450, because this is precisely why we have the confidential financial disclosure system, which is that the filer is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Now, there is a full body of laws and regulations to which the employee is subject, the filer is subject. But the primary role that we ask intermediate reviewers and supervisors in particular to perform for us is a conflicts of interest analysis, because effectively what we're trying to do is prevent conflicts of interest. So what we seek from supervisors is that you can bring the knowledge that you have to the table of what an employee works on, so that you can help identify potential conflicts of interest. And when we talk about conflicts of interest, Patrick's going to tell us here in a second what it is, but we want you to think about it broadly defined. We want you to see your role as flagging potential conflicts of interest, not necessarily making a legal determination about whether or not someone has violated law or regulation. So Patrick, what is a conflict of interest for purposes of what we're going to be asking supervisors and intermediate reviewers to do for us?
Well, in the simplest terms, a conflict of interest is any time you have an overlap between someone's government work and their financial holdings or other financial interest. So where we see a nexus or a confluence between the work that someone does for the government and those financial entanglements or assets or sources of income outside of the government, anytime there's a nexus between those two things, that's a potential conflict of interest, and that's precisely what we're looking for.
So why is it important? Like, what is the importance of being able to determine whether or not someone has the potential for a conflict of interest?
Well, conflicts of interest can harm our work, our agency's work, our missions in a myriad of ways. For one, they can introduce bias, and this may not be conscious bias. It can be subtle bias, but that bias can harm the ability of employees to make decisions and governments to carry out its function. It can harm our work in some ways, because if bias is introduced to the decision-making process, we can't be certain that our work is being informed by the public's interest and not being polluted by some private pecuniary interest. It can also result in adverse actions. So we can have challenges or investigations that result from actual conflicts of interest. For example, in a procurement, if we introduce bias into the process, there could be a bid protest. In other kinds of work, there may be congressional investigations or IG investigations to find out if the decision-making process is broken. Those are harmful to our work. They're a distraction, and they're things that we want to avoid. And perhaps most importantly, we are dealing with the criminal law. So some forms of financial conflict of interest are indeed crimes. And we certainly don't want our employees to be exposed to criminal liability for work they're doing for the government. So we have the financial disclosure system in place to prevent these problems, to identify them before they occur and take steps to avoid them.
And I think that one of the highlights here for our reviewers is to understand that really this is about protecting the programs and operations of the government. We're trying to protect the work of the government. Yes, we want to make sure that employees themselves are not, committing crimes, but our overarching goal is to protect the integrity of the programs and operations over which, you have cognizance.
Absolutely. And as supervisors, that's one of our priorities. So we want to empower you to protect your programs from conflicts.
So What do folks need to know in order to prevent conflicts of interest? What are the pieces of information that they're going to bring to the table to make a determination about this?
So as we're looking for that nexus between the employee's duties and their financial holdings, we need those two pieces of information. We need to know what it is that the employee does at work, and we need to know what their financial holdings and business relationships are. So that's where you come in as a supervisor or other intermediate reviewer. You know better than anyone in the ethics office what your employees are up to day to day, what they may be assigned to in the coming months and years. So we are asking you to bring that piece of information to the review process. And the form itself, the OGE Form 450, is the source of information about the financial holdings and business relationships of your employees. And with those two pieces of information, we hope that you will be able to help us identify where there are potential for conflicts. So Cheryl, who files an OGE Form 450? How do we decide who needs to complete this report?
Well, as an initial matter, it's important to distinguish them from public filers. And in order to do that, by regulation, anyone who files an OGE Form 450 is going to be a GS-15 or equivalent or below. But more importantly, what we're looking for, what the confidential financial disclosure filer is a person who has responsibilities or duties that can actually affect the non-federal entities. So what you're doing as a risk analysis is you're trying to determine, and as supervisors have a really critical role in helping the ethics office to identify who should be a 450 filer, because it is very much a matter of who among your employees have responsibilities and duties that will affect non-federal entities, because they are the people who, by definition, are going to be most likely to have a potential for conflict of interest, because they have duties that can affect the financial interests of non-federal entities. And each agency is responsible for determining who their 450 filers are. They are not determined by statute or regulation. Each agency makes a determination about which of their employees fall within the ambit of a 450 filer. And OGE has created a job aid to assist ethics officials and to assist you as a supervisor if you are asked by the ethics shop to assist them in identifying who should legitimately file an OGE Form 450. And this is a checklist, effectively, that helps you understand what sorts of criteria you might want to consider in determining whether or not someone likely should be considered an OGE 450 filer. And when you're doing this, we would suggest to you that you look at it from the standpoint of, is it somebody who needs to file? Is it someone who doesn't need to file? And in situations where you're not sure, if you're using the checklist and you're not sure if somebody legitimately files within or outside, that you take it to the ethics shop. You don't automatically lump them into filers, and you don't automatically exclude them as filers, but that you do your level best to decide, yeah, these people seem to legitimately meet the criteria as those are laid out in the checklist, or no, these are folks who clearly don't meet any of the criteria in this checklist. And when you have a question, to go to your ethics shop and let them help you make a decision about whether or not someone who might be on the border should be included in the filing population or not.
When I worked in an agency, we asked our supervisors to make 3 lists: a yes list, a no list, and an I'm not sure list. And we found that in some cases, when we were doing this for the first time, that the not sure list was quite long. And I was happy as an ethics official to help them work through that process, because having people file unnecessarily is a waste of your time, it's a waste of their time, and it's a waste of the agency's resources. So we want to make sure we're being precise in these determinations.
Now, in terms of what actually gets filed, I think in the majority of situations, it's the OGE Form 450 that most agencies use with respect to their confidential financial disclosure filers. And there is a new version this year, a 2019 version. So I'm going to put a plug in right now to make sure this year when people are filing, make sure they're using the 2019 version, because it contains some substantive changes that were made to the regulation, and so prior versions shouldn't be used. But some of you may have alternative reporting formats or alternative disclosure systems, and so you might have a form that is different from the the OGE Form 450. In a moment, Patrick and I are going to walk you through a sample of an OGE Form 450 and how you might go about reviewing that. But I would also encourage you, if you as a supervisor honestly believe that the OG Form 450 is not a good fit for the kinds of conflicts or the kinds of things that could create a conflict for your employees, you should discuss with the ethics office whether or not your agency might want to consider creating an alternative form or creating an alternative system for your file or for your employees that could better protect your programs and operations from potential conflicts of interest.
I think that's an important point, that this program is for the protection of agencies. So there's a lot of flexibility. And as leaders in your organization, we want you to work with the ethics office to use that flexibility where necessary.
So what's the process for review, Patrick? What's kind of the quick and dirty that we can tell people about how to go do this review process?
So the nice thing, it's a two-step process. We need to look at the duties of the employees who we oversee and look at their interests and find out if there is a nexus or a confluence or a potential for those duties to affect the financial interest. And again, here, I'd encourage you to use that yes, no, maybe format. As you're going through the report, we have to certify that they're in compliance with all laws and regulations. So for each asset, we need to determine whether, yes, it's a conflict, no, it's not going to pose a potential conflict. And if there are things that we can't do that for, we need to do some work to make sure that we can get to a resolution. So as you review these reports, I would encourage you to look at each entry and say, either no, there's no possibility of a nexus between the work and this entry, or this is definitely a situation where we have a nexus, and then we need to notify the ethics office so that we can take care of that. Or if we're not sure, make the ethics office aware so that we can dig into it a little more and make sure we come to a resolution.
I also like to point out to folks that I think when people think about what they're anticipating seeing on the financial disclosure form, they think of stocks and mutual funds and business and income. But it's also a place where your employees are going to be disclosing outside activities. For those of you who are agencies that have a prior approval requirement for outside activities, this is a way for, as a supervisor or intermediate reviewer, you can be another set of eyes for the ethics office. You can use this as an opportunity if somebody is disclosing an outside activity and you're not sure whether or not they've gotten prior approval, that you can call your employees' attention to it and make sure that they've gotten prior approval for anything that they include as an outside activity. And then you also then need to do a conflicts analysis, much as you do the same conflicts analysis on assets and other forms of income. When you're looking at an outside activity, you're going to want to bring the same sensibility to it, which does the organization that this person has this relationship with, is it something that could create a potential conflict of interest with the employee's duties? Does it present clearly no conflict of interest? Or do I have questions about whether or not this is an entity that either comes before us or could be affected by the work that we do? Also, another question that can come up in the outside activity area is it an organization that may come before other parts of the federal government? Because that could also present a different kind of conflict of interest. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get into the actual example of a 450 filing. So let's turn to the 450, and what we've done is we've given you a screenshot here of a filled out Form 450. We want to sort of highlight for you things to look for, kind of where to put your eyes when these forms come in front of you. And when you get a Form 450, we would ask you to take a look, obviously, at the position and title of the person whose form you're looking at. And you really should look at that first, because that's what we want you to do, is we want you to have in your mind, before you begin looking at any other aspect of the form, what are the duties and responsibilities of this position? Given what this employee does, what are the types of things that if I were to see them would cause me some concern? So once you've had a chance to look at the title and position, then we'd ask you to take a look at the next section down there that I have highlighted. This is where the employee is going to indicate whether or not they have actually had things to disclose in the various parts of the form. And again, this is a place where you can be of some help to ethics officials, because any place where they say yes, where they've marked a yes box, you should expect to see things having been disclosed on that part. Any place where they've said no, you should not see anything disclosed on that part of the form. If you think or if you see that an employee has basically filled out this part incorrectly, e.g., they said there was something they needed to disclose and there was nothing on the part that they said they had something to disclose, it's best to flag that early, because you are going to have to go back to the filer. You or the ethics shop is going to have to go back to the filer and ask for that information. So in order to save everybody time so that you're not having to look at something 2 and 3 times, to the extent that you could flag those kinds of things in advance for the ethics office, that would be terrific. Likewise, just a few things. If you were the first person to receive the report, if your filers send their reports to you first before they go to the ethics office, then you would be the one who would be responsible for putting the date received by the agency in the box, so that A, your filer can get credit for having filed it on time, and B, to let you know there is a 60-day review limit, that that 60-day review starts to toll upon the date that the agency receives the form from the filer. So again, it's just a sort of a reminder to you that because you have an integral role in reviewing these forms, your part in making sure that that's completed within the 60 days to the greatest extent possible is much appreciated by the ethics office. And so we would just encourage you to make sure that to the extent that you have those responsibilities, that you're aware of what those responsibilities are.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what actually appears on the report. So we're going to start with part 1 because it comes first. And some of the things that we can expect to see on part 1 are financial holdings of our employees and sources of income. So those might be securities in the form of stock. They may be mutual funds or exchange traded funds. They could be current or prior non-federal employment if this is a new employee or they have concurrent employment. Their spouse's employment if they have a spouse and he or she is employed, and any outside business or earned income. So really we're looking at assets and sources of income for the filer, spouse, and dependent children. So let's take a look at how this might appear on a form. Here we have a sample of part 1 for our food safety inspector. And our filer has indicated that there are 4 holdings, 4 entries on the form. And again, what we want to do is use the same framework, the yes, no, maybe framework. And considering the duties of this position, someone who's involved in the regulation of food safety, we can look at this first entry, Walmart. And we know that Walmart is a vendor of groceries and foodstuffs. So maybe there's a possibility for a nexus between this employee's duties and this holding. We don't know if this is a stock holding, an employment holding, but it really doesn't matter. We're just looking for that nexus between the two. So if we're not sure, we'd want to make a note of that for the ethics office and say, we want to look into this, make sure there's not a problem. Next, we have the iShares U.S. Financial Services ETF. So this is an exchange traded fund comprised of financial services companies. Given what we know about the filer, that our filer is involved in overseeing food safety, there's unlikely to be a nexus. So we may be able to say that there's no nexus here. There's no potential for conflict. We could indicate that to the ethics office. Third, we have Tyson Food, which is a food provider. And we may know that, oh, wait, let's stop. This is definitely a nexus with the work we do at the agency and maybe specifically with the work this employee does. We need to flag that. We need to let someone know. So we could indicate that on the form and make sure that the ethics office is notified of that. And finally, we have the Doe family farm, which is a little unusual. We are not sure if this is an outside position. We're not sure what kind of farm it is, what they produce, whether they produce food for human consumption. So this may be another question mark that we want to chase down before we certify the report. So the way we might do that is something like this. Not sure, no conflict. Conflict, definitely need to do something. And again, not sure. So again, we want to use the yes, no, maybe framework.
So on the cover page that we just were looking at a moment ago, the filer indicated that they didn't have any liabilities, but they did indicate that they had some Part 3 entries. And that's typically what you're going to see, I think, on most 450s, is that people may not have liabilities, but Part 1 and Part 3 are commonly filled out. So for Part 3, this is where we're looking at outside activities and what we mentioned earlier. And filers are the filer only has to report things for themselves on this part of the form. And so common things that you will see there is if the Filer had a prior employment position that you may see their prior employer identified. If they have any current outside employment, which could include consulting, it could include an employee-owned business. We would expect to see that on an outside activity listing. And other certain outside activities where maybe the employee is not an employee of an outside organization or does not necessarily derive any income from an outside activity, but they serve, for instance, as an officer or on the board of directors or as a trustee. We would expect to see those types of outside activities included on this part of the form as well. Now, what should not be here are any positions that the employee might hold that are done as part of their official duties. We're only looking for things for outside activities and outside positions that the employee would hold in a personal capacity, in a non-official government capacity. So if we look at our filers' outside positions, what they've disclosed, you'll see that the Doe family farm is listed as a family business, and the employee indicates that they actually do hold a position with that farm. So the other part of Part 3 that is helpful is it gives you a fuller picture of some things that you may have seen on Part 1. So here we can see that, as I said, the filer has a position as treasurer. Now, what you're going to do here with anything you see on Part 3 is very similar to what we would ask you to do on Part 1, which is basically to decide, does the organization that's being listed here, is it an organization, A, that could be affected by the work that our government employee does? B, is it an organization that may very well come before our agency? And C, is it a position? Does the employee hold a position where they might be likely to be making communications to other government agencies? So those are sort of the three aspects that we would be looking at with any kind of outside position that is listed, which is, again, A, can it be affected? Can it be affected by the performance of the government, of the employee's duties? Is it likely that the organization would be one that would come before our agency? And or is it a position where the employee might be making communications to other government entities? And with Doe Family Farm, we have a question mark about whether or not the farm itself would present a potential conflict of interest for the employee. And again, we don't know for certain whether or not, as treasurer of the farm, whether or not the farm maybe seeks government subsidies or whether the farm seeks things from other government agencies. So that would be a question mark and something to flag for the ethics office to take a look at.
And with outside positions, typically these do result in a need for counseling. So in most cases, employees will need to receive advice from the ethics office about their outside activities.
Okay, so Patrick,
Sure.
Part 4.
So Part 4 is where we see agreements and arrangements. So these may be retirement or other benefits that are residual from employment before someone joined the federal government. It may be arrangements or agreements for employment in the future, and it may also include leaves of absence or similar arrangements with a previous employer. And again, here we're doing a similar exercise. We want to determine whether or not there is a nexus between any entries listed on Part 4 and the duties of the position, the work of our agency, or make representations before the government. So here we have the farm again. It says that they will continue to receive payment for services as treasurer of the family farm. So again, the question we ask is there, would the farm come before this employee? Does the farm have business or otherwise appear before our agency? Or would our employee as the treasurer be asked to make a representation to any part of the government? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, we want to make sure that an ethics official takes another look at it.
So what do we do if we find a potential conflict of interest?
So the first two we need to do immediately, which is contact the ethics office and ask the employee to stop working on anything that might pose a conflict. So if you see an entry and you say, oh, this employee has been assigned to something that may affect that entity, ask them to stop until they can receive advice and let the ethics office know. And then after you have done those two things, the ethics officer or the attorney or ethics official who's working on the report will work with you and the employee to come up with a resolution. This may involve selling a potentially conflicting holding, resigning from a conflicting position. There may be a regulatory provision that allows them to continue to participate, or we may have to reassign the employee to different work, but you'll have to work together to come up with that solution. And again, we want to do that as soon as possible because our goal is to prevent conflicts of interest.
And I think the important thing here is to remember that you're not being asked to resolve anything that you find. You're being asked to flag any potential problem that you see, and to let the ethics office know as soon as you have spotted anything that you think could be potentially problematic.
So how else, as supervisors, can we help prevent conflicts of interest? Well, 450 review, confidential review, is an annual occurrence, but there are things we can do throughout the year to protect the work of our agencies. One, we can think about conflicts when we're assigning work to employees, think about whether there's potential for conflict. We can notify the ethics office when there are promotions, changes in roles, or transfers between jobs. The ethics official who reviews this report is going to assume that person persists in that position, but if they have new duties, the potential for conflict changes. So letting someone know about that so you can take another look is something that can really help protect your agency and its programs. We can also remind employees that they should avoid conflicts when starting new work. So if they're assigned to something and they think there may be a conflict, they should seek advice. They may be acquiring new assets throughout the year. They should think about conflicts as they do that and seek advice where necessary. And if they're engaging in non-federal employment, also their spouse is changing jobs, change their conflict situation. So they may need to seek advice to avoid conflicts, and reminding people periodically can help them to do so. Another thing that you can do as a supervisor is to tell the ethics office when you're thinking about hiring. We find that in many cases, the most urgent problems with conflicts of interest come as people are entering government service from a non-government employer. And if we don't deal with those problems timely, they can become real problems rather than mere potential conflicts. So involving the ethics office as soon as possible helps us to avoid those. So we hope you'll keep this in mind as we move through the year. And we thank you for your cooperation in this important work, and hope that we have helped you to do that more efficiently and more effectively.